There is a story.
This is Dr. Kate O'Neill. Now she's a reproductive endocrinologist. But this story that she's about to tell you takes place when she was a young resident.
So when I was a resident, probably about 24, 25, I had already gone through my first year of training. So I had learned all the basic tools. I was starting to feel like a functioning physician. And I went to a community center where there was a lot of people that this was the first time they had seen a doctor. They had never seen a female doctor. They'd never seen a gynecologist. And I walk into the clinic area. I kind of have an idea, a sense in my mind of the things I'm going to see. Polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, the very common gynecologic conditions. And I actually really liked puberty. I found it very interesting. So when I see the first patient with my attending physician, who was wonderful, and Dr. Veronica Cross, I still remember her, I went and saw a 15-year-old girl who was there with her mom. And, she had a bunch of sisters and they'd all had their periods early. And so she's 15, she hadn't had her period. Why hadn't she had her period? What was going on? And so I instantly go into doctor mode. Okay, I got it. Delayed puberty. What are the causes of delayed puberty? It could be coming from the hypothalamus, could be coming from the level of the ovary. It could be and so I start asking all of those history questions and I'm like, okay, there's, this is leaning towards something structural. And I put her, please put your feet in the footholds. And this is the first gynecologic exam she's having. So I'm trying to be, sensitive to that. And I feel like we've got a good rapport. And then I tell her, okay, now let your knees fall out to the side. Everything looks as I would expect. Typically, I'd already done a breast exam. She has, appropriate breast development for a 15-year-old. She has axillary hair. She has pubic hair. So all of the things that I would expect a 15-year-old have in terms of pubertal development. She has labia. And then I part the labia, ready to do my exam. And where I would see usually an opening, which is the vagina, there's just skin, nothing. I was not anticipating that. I was not ready for that. I had learned about that way back, a neuron is firing, but I couldn't really get there. And I just froze. And at that moment, looked back at Dr. Cross, am I? And Dr. Cross is like, okay, great. All right. And so exam is done. Okay, go ahead and get dressed. I watched her as she counseled the patient that she had been born without a uterus, that she had a condition called Mayer-Rokitansky-Kuster-Hauser syndrome. She was born without a uterus. This means you're not going to have periods like your friends, and watching the patient kind of process that and watching mom try to support her, but kind of also in her head, what does this mean for me? What are we going to do? And then she said, okay, I'm not going to have periods. Okay. And then how am I going to have babies? She didn't recognize that that also meant you needed the uterus to have a baby. So at that time we said, you still have ovaries, you have eggs. So thank God IVF was around at that time. You could go through a process and we could collect your eggs. But knowing for a lot of the patients that I was seeing at this community clinic, that was never going to be affordable for them. So for all practical purposes, I was telling her she was never going to have her own children that were genetically related to her. And watching a 15-year-old process that, it was heartbreaking in many ways, but it made me realize that's what I want to do. I want to work in this area of medicine. And after that, I became obsessed with the development of the female reproductive tract and obsessed with the uterus in general.
Hi, I'm Golda, and this is Overlooked, a podcast where we bring women's health stories to life. On this episode, I'm talking to Dr. Kate O'Neill, assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an infertility specialist, and she's incredibly passionate about her work. I asked Kate why she does what she does, and the story you just heard was her answer to that question. In this episode, we're going to talk about the ovaries. For an organ that is responsible for so much, it's incredible to me how little we know about it. Kate O'Neill wants to change that. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Golda. How are you?
I'm good. Right. Let me actually, this show is going to be big on storytelling. So let me tell you a little story of how I found you, which is kind of a fun story.
Tell me.
So I was doing some research on the ovaries, and I thought, right, what does the internet have to tell me about the ovaries? And I came across this National Institutes of Health page with this title: Anatomic Nomenclature and Three-Dimensional Regional Model of the Human Ovary Call for a New Paradigm. And you know what, Kate? You had me at call for a new paradigm.
Good. That was the intent. I like it.
So tell me, for the uninitiated, tell me like in one sentence what that means, what you're trying to do.
I would say, first of all, for the title, I have to give the entire group credit because it really was we workshopped that title quite a bit. So I cannot take credit alone. But we are a collective of experts in the ovary in various ways, in looking at the ovary through radiologic images, looking at the ovary underneath the microscope, looking at it clinically, looking at it in terms of research. And we all came together and said, we're trying to study and describe the ovary in multiple ways. And we don't have the terms. The ovary is described really in such crude terms. It's this pole, one layer, and another layer. And so it's really hard when you start doing very, very specific research to describe where you are studying, which part of the ovary you're studying, or clinically, which part of the ovary you are having to remove for a cyst or for fertility preservation, or what are these things. So we said, we all need to speak the same language, and we all need a more specific language to describe the ovary. So that's how this group came together, and we really addressed that call with that paper.
Tell me the origin story of how all of this came to you and your team. Like, where did this moment of, wait, why don't we even have this language come from?
So I am a part of the NIH Common Fund's Human Molecular Bioatlas program, or HubMap. And my co-principal investigator, Jin-Young Kim, together our charge is to build a 3D spatially resolved molecular map of the normal female reproductive tract in the non-pregnant state. It's a mouthful. Basically, what we're trying to do, I always describe it to my friends and even some of my non-gynecologic colleagues as like, if you can imagine Google Earth. You have Google Earth and you can see the Earth, and then you zoom in on North America, and then you zoom in on my home state of Michigan, and then you zoom in even further on my hometown of Grosse Pointe, and then even further to my house. And then you can actually see my dad's car parked in there. So you can go down to that level. What they're trying to do is the same thing for the human body. So you see the human body, and then you can zoom in on the ovary. Then you can zoom in on the various tissue layers of the ovary. Then you can zoom into the cells that make up those tissue layers. And even a layer further, you can say, these are the proteins that are expressed in those specific cells. These are the genes that we're seeing. These are the RNA messengers that we're seeing in that cell. And it provides an incredible resource for individuals to use. It's open access, so everyone will have access to this data. And then they can compare disease states to normal. And that's really important because thankfully, we're not taking normal ovaries out of women. We're not taking normal uteri out of women. And we don't have that baseline to study. So you can get a lot of disease tissue, such as cancer. You're taking it out all the time, but you need that normal to compare it to. And so that was the goal of the HubMap program, and specifically for me, the female reproductive tract. And as I'm taking these ovaries from these very, generous deceased donors, and as I'm taking this tissue, which we're very grateful for, I'm realizing I don't have a way to describe what I'm actually profiling here. So I needed a better way. And I started reaching out to people like, okay, I know there's the hilum and there's the cortex and the medulla, but like, how can I get more specific? And people were saying, there is no more specific. That's it. And so that's kind of where I started reaching out to people, and people started talking to people. And we were like, we should all get together and talk about this with a multidisciplinary group, because sometimes some of the things I would say is, oh, well, why don't we describe it in this way? And the surgeon next to me would say, that's just not possible. We don't get to that level. Or I'd say that, and the radiologist would say, you have that level of detail when you're looking in the operating room, but I don't have that level of detail when I'm looking at an image that I'm seeing on the screen. So we all needed to work together to come up with something that was more specific and also feasible.
So this is a really stunning thing to me because I'm like, wait, it is 2024 and I'm hearing someone in your position saying that we describe the ovary in really crude terms and we don't have a specific language. And I don't know. It's just one of those things that I was like, I guess we're not anywhere near as far ahead as I thought. And of course, lots of other thoughts come to me about sort of why the ovary as opposed to any other organ. And we'll get into all of that. But can you give me an example? Can you bring that to life for me? When you say all we've got is this non-specific language to describe the ovary, say a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah. So, the ovary is an ovoid structure in the uterus, usually about 2 to 3 centimeters in reproductive age women. And when it has been described in anatomic texts, they talk about one side of it, the side of it that's being closest to the fallopian tube, and the opposite pole of it. So there's the hilum of the ovary, and then there's the other side. And then when we talk about it, it has many, many layers, like an onion. And we describe the outside as the cortex and the inside as the medulla. And that's it. That's basically how they referred to the ovary before. We needed more specific language so we could even start to put into context some of the studies that had already been done. But we can't study that if we don't have these terms available.
So I'm going to ask you a really simple question. No doubt it has a complicated answer. Take it anywhere you want to go with it. But why are we in this position that we don't have this level of detail? We don't have this specific language. We don't have these ways to describe it.
I have a couple of reasons. The non-cynical part of me says, well, we haven't had this, the technology has developed at a very rapid pace, and we haven't had the need to describe every single cell and be able to map an organ. So technology has developed now that we can, and so now we need those terms. But the non-cynical part of me says, well, we still have more specific terms for other organs. So I think the fact that only 51% of the population has ovaries, and that 51% of the population has not always been making the decisions about nomenclature are probably contributing to it. But I do think part of the reason is because the technology has developed and now we can describe things at a single cell. So now that you can describe things that specifically, you need to give better coordinates.
That's a very eloquent answer, I have to say. Thank you. I would have gone like, because we're women. But anyway, okay, so tell me, so 2 questions really. The first is a timeline. Tell me when you started on this work and where you are right now. And then I want to ask you a little bit more about, the work ahead for you.
Yes, my team started on this back in, it would have been 4 years ago. So it was really 2020. I thought I knew everything about the female reproductive tract, but we spent a year really learning, getting the tissue, learning how to process the tissue, reaching out to lots. People have been incredibly generous, not only through HubMap. There's a community through HubMap where we share a lot of information, but also outside of HubMap, just reaching out to people and saying, when you're processing ovaries, how do you do it so that you keep all of the structures intact? And so we spent a year really just figuring out how to process the tissue, what kind of studies we wanted to do on it, which were most informative, what were other groups doing so that we could kind of combine all of this data together. Because if you have all of this data about the female reproductive tract and you have completely different information and data about the heart, how are you going to do some of those very interesting comparisons to see, is a ciliated epithelial cell that is in the heart, how is it different than a ciliated epithelial cell in the fallopian tube? Those are interesting questions. We want to ask those, but if you have totally different tests that you've done on those 2 organ systems, you're not going to be able to do them. So we spent about a year doing that. And then we spent a year collecting tissue from actual donors, which was you're trying to get tissue from healthy donors. So you have to define what a healthy donor is. We worked really closely with the Gift of Life and their coordinators identifying those donors and approaching their families and asking for permission, and then procuring the tissue, storing the tissue, and optimizing a lot of the studies that we were doing. It's not as simple as you'd like it to be, like a cookbook, like step 1, take the ovary, step 2, put it in a tube, step 3, here's all of the RNA that comes out of that piece. But it's a lot more work than that. So we spent a year doing that. And then we spent the third, and now what is the fourth year, creating all of the data. My entire life is about delayed gratification in all aspects. And this project is completely delayed gratification because it was 3 years of really working on what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And now we're finally producing the data. And that's very exciting.
No, that's great. Delayed gratification. I like the way that you describe it there. Let me ask you, did you receive at any point in this timeline, did you receive any pushback?
I did receive pushback. I received pushback with people saying, who cares? Why do we care about this? Both on the clinical side and on the basic side. People saying, we don't need to know that much about the ovary. And I think that's very interesting because how can you know what you don't need to know when you don't have the information? But I got a lot of that. I got a lot of, nobody's ever going to use this. I got a lot of, people are so different that if you study 8 to 10 people, which is what we were setting out to do, if you study 8 to 10 people, is that really going to give you any meaningful data? So those are some of the questions and some of the pushback that I got.
I would love to take that on, right? Just for the skeptics or for maybe people who don't fully understand the importance of the work that you're doing. How do you answer those critics? So we don't need to know much about the ovary. How do you answer that?
The ovary contains eggs, which are half of the cells that are necessary to generate life. I cannot think of a more important organ to know, and I don't know why everyone wouldn't want to know absolutely everything you can about that tissue, because literally life will not continue without it. So I don't even really know how to address it, because really without the ovaries and the cells within them, you will not have future generations.
I mean, yes, you won't get any argument from me on that. And then, the second thing you said of being asked, nobody's ever going to use this. I kind of look at that question in the other way. And, I'd love to hear more about how this will be used once we have this information, what is going to change. But I also have a momentary sense of loss of all the things in science that haven't happened because we haven't had this already, right? And, of course, there's a long and complicated history in medicine with women's bodies. But if we had this 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, if our information that we gathered and the knowledge that we knew about the ovaries matched that of the heart, for example, what could we have done before? How many lives could we have saved? What could we have changed? Is my reaction when I hear you say that, just a sense of my God, it's taken us so long to get here, and it's great that we're here, so let's push forward. But the sense of looking back. But before I get too morose about it, push this forward for me. Tell me what you hope will change now that we're starting to gather this data, this what seems like very basic foundational data.
Yeah, I think part of it is, in order to study and understand disease, you have to understand normal first. And it's not sexy. It's not that fun. People would rather study the disease tissue. It comes out, so it's easier to study. But until you know normal, you can't even identify disease, especially early disease, right? Because early disease doesn't necessarily need to come out. And so I think when we want to start in medicine in general, we want early detection. We want less invasive diagnostic tests, looking for things that are in the circulation, early markers. And I think the only way you can identify abnormal is when you know normal. And there's still so much about the ovary and my other favorite organs, the uterus and the fallopian tubes. I don't want to leave them out either, but there is so much that we have left to know about normal. People aren't taking normal ovaries out of women, nor should they. And so you end up with only getting pieces of normal ovaries from somebody who's probably having surgery otherwise, so it's not completely normal, or it's, a very small piece because it's a willing volunteer, something like that. So I think having this resource is you have the ovary in its entirety to be able to study down to the cellular level. I think that is going to be very worthwhile for some future research.
So this is a podcast called Overlooked. I think it's clear what's been overlooked in this conversation. But I want to ask all my guests on this show a very broad question, and you can interpret it in any way you want to. But the question is, how is this inequality felt most deeply?
I have two places. So when I was an OBGYN resident, I would see patients with ovarian cancer, patients like your mom. And unfortunately, or luckily for you, most of the patients that I would see were at very, very advanced stages of cancer. And we know that with very advanced ovarian cancer, the mortality rates are very high. And I would take care of these patients, and they would be so sick before this would get detected. And just personally, I have an aunt right now who has advanced ovarian cancer, and the same thing happened to her. She was so sick up until the point where she was looking pregnant until people said, something's going on here. What's going on here? It just amazes me still to this day that we don't have better early detection for women with ovarian cancer. So I think that if we had done some of these studies earlier and knew what normal looked like, we have a lot of abnormal to compare it with. I think if we had done that, we might be farther along there. If we had a little bit more funding in that area of research, I wouldn't say a little bit, I'm being too polite. If we had a lot more funding towards women's health, I think we would be farther along there. And if we had done some of this early work and funded the early work. I'm not the first person who's wanted to do it. People have wanted to study normal ovary for a very long time. There hasn't been the interest. I really applaud the NIH. We weren't in the first round of funding. The female reproductive tract was not one of the first organ systems that was covered, but it was in the second round. So I give them a lot of credit for that. So I think in ovarian cancer and in the other patient population that I really think about is the patient population I was just talking about, that I treat infertility patients. So I see patients come in a lot of times that are in their late 30s, but sometimes that are in their early 20s. And they say, my periods have started spacing out a little bit. I want to figure out what's going on. And then, through a series of tests, we diagnose them with primary ovarian insufficiency. I wish that I had more tools in the armamentarium to help them. I do have things like donor egg, adoption. I'm really happy that those options exist. My mom was adopted, so I appreciate adoption and all the routes to parenthood. But a lot of people want children that are genetically related to them. And I wish that I had better tools. But, talk about overlooked. Infertility is seen as an inconvenience. It is not seen as a medical condition. And I think that's a lot of where this comes from. People say, they can't have, that 26-year-old can't have kids on her own. Well, she can adopt a baby. It's fine. It's no big deal. I don't think people really realize the impact that has. People want to know what is going on in my body. So if I don't have the words to describe it, pictures say 1,000 words, but I can say this part here, which we don't have a name for. That makes you feel very foolish to patients.
Yeah, I guess I thought it was somebody else's job to do it. And then I talked to someone like you. I'm like, what do you mean we have no way to describe this? If you guys don't have a way to describe it, then what is going on?
It's funny that you say it's not your job. I'm like, I know it's my job. It's my job. And it's not for lack of effort. I want to study. And my patients say that too. Well, what do you mean we don't have any treatment? How do we not know why this happens? And I want to say it's not because we don't care. It's not because we're not interested or we don't have any ideas on how to do it, it really does get down to the fact that it is not a priority for the institutions that fund it. That just has been an uphill battle every single step of the way. So I think you're right. Conversation is the way to, it's the first way, because it's not like you're just going to go and demand money. That's not going to happen. But I think conversation is the way to open people's eyes to the fact that that's where the barrier is right now. The barrier isn't like we don't have the technology or we don't have the people who are willing to do the work. It's that there's that missing piece, which is the support for it.
Yeah. And I think now that people are aware, I think the support will come, right? Because, you know, my whole Instagram feed is full of like women's health, this, that, and the other. But the thing that this show does is as much as possible to take it down to a granular level of the individual experience, right? And then somebody else can collate all of that data together, but nobody is gathering these individual stories. So that's what I wanted to do with this.
Well, I love it.
Kate, thank you so much. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I so appreciate you sharing all of this with me.
Golda, thank you for having me. Thank you for shining a light on this. And thank you for all of the experiences you shared about you and your mom and your sister in season 1.
We're building a community around women's health so that no one is overlooked. If you'd like to be part of it, hit the follow button on this podcast wherever you're listening to this, or head to overlookedpod.com to find out more. Overlooked is written and produced by me, Golda Arthur. Jessica Martinez-Dios is the show's associate producer. You can get in touch with the show by emailing overlookedpodcast23@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.